I'm a historian of the ancient Mediterranean, and my particular area of expertise is interactions between different cultures in the ancient Mediterranean world and beyond, which is the fancy academic way of saying I study barbarians. So that's what I'm here to talk about today, the idea of the barbarian, where it comes from, how it has changed over time, and why it is still with us, and why it is still useful to us. Now, I'm pretty sure that all of you have in your mind an idea of what a barbarian is. Probably everyone has some mental image that comes to mind when I say the word barbarian. If we went around the room, we'd probably come up with something fairly consistent. We won't do that because that would be audience participation, and this is Finland. However, we'd probably come up with something rather like this. Big muscles, huge axe, lots of naked skin, leather and fur, kind of looks like Arnold. This is the image of the barbarian as we know it. This is the modern barbarian. And this image draws a lot on recent works, like recent in my terms. Things like Conan, Red Sonja, these kinds of literary works. It's as part of the games that we are familiar with. I played a couple of games today with barbarians. But those ideas are part of a much older, much longer history. And it's that older, longer history I want to dig into more today, here with us together. So a barbarian, the word barbarian, it's one of many words that we have for saying someone who isn't one of us. There's lots of words we can use to say someone who's not one of us. We can say stranger, foreigner, outsider, muukalainen, ulkomaalainen, maahanmuuttaja. There's lots of ways of saying someone who isn't one of us. Barbarian is more than that. Barbarian is not just not one of us. A barbarian is someone who can't even understand what it is to be one of us. When we say that something is barbaric, we mean it's not just different from us, we mean it is different from us to an extreme. So where does this idea of the extreme difference come from? Well, we can start very far back in ancient Greece. This is where our word barbarian comes from the Greek barbaros. A word with very old roots in Greece. The earliest case of it that we can find, we think, goes into the Mycenaean period, around 1300 BCE. That's trying to interpret some writing that isn't quite perfectly understood. The earliest time we're absolutely sure we got the word is in the Iliad, the earliest work of Greek literature from around 750 BCE. And in its earliest uses, the word barbaros means a person who doesn't speak Greek. It's a linguistic term, someone whose language sounds like nonsense, just sounds like bar, 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 bar. Why bar, 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 bar? Well, not really sure. There's something about this pattern, this rhythm, labial plosive, b or pa, combined with a liquid, an r or an l. For some reason, that sounds like nonsense to us. Like in English, we have words like babble, blah, blah, blah. Other ways of saying that sounds like nonsense. And it's not just in the Indo-European languages that we find this. In Finnish, you can say pala, 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 raparperi, raparperi. And these words, ways of saying, that sounds like complete nonsense to me. Yeah, but for whatever reason, this is the word, barbaros, that begins meaning simply someone who doesn't speak Greek, someone whose language is not Greek. And the ancient Greeks had lots of contact with people who were not speakers of Greek. Because Greece, despite whatever you may have been told in school, ancient Greece was not the center of anything. Ancient Greece was the edge of the world. Greece was poor, it was backwards, it was violent, it was politically fragmented. lots of people, in order to make a living, had to leave Greece. And they found their living in other places, and many of them through contact with other cultures that were older, larger, richer, more sophisticated, more advanced. Places like Egypt, Lydia, the Phoenicians, the Persian Empire. And this sense of a place that is richer, a place that's more advanced, a place that is more sophisticated, that hangs on to this word barbaros. As the Greeks originally used this word, that is the connotation that goes with it. A place that is more sophisticated, a people who are richer, more advanced, older and wiser than we are. But the use of this word got more complicated after 490 and 480 BCE, as that is when Greece was invaded twice by the Persian Empire. This was a traumatic experience for the Greeks. Everyone who lived through it was shaped by it. And the legacy and the memory of that experience, that invasion, even though it was defeated, even though the Greeks won against the Persians, the memory of that invasion, the legacy of it continued on. And from that point on, that further shaped how Greeks used the word barbaros and what they meant when they said barbaros. From that point on, it began to mean not just someone who talks funny, not just someone who is different from us, but someone who is worse, someone who is not as good as we are, someone who lacks something or has failed in something. The first, or at least the earliest, surviving piece of literature that we have that really tries to grapple with, well, what does this actually mean? What do we mean when we say that someone is a barbaros? Is the Histories by Herodotus. They're written about 50 years after the wars against the Persians and about those events. Herodotus was a historian, a geographer, philosopher. He was interested in culture, interested in mythology and stories, interested in almost everything. But his overall project was to try and explain, how did we poor, fragmented Greeks defeat the biggest, richest, most powerful empire in the world? And he went out into the world looking for that explanation, not just by looking at Greeks, but by looking at other people as well. And there are two people to whom Herodotus paid particular attention. They were the Egyptians and the Scythians. These were both groups of people with whom Greeks had lots of experience. There was a very long, very close, very warm history between Greeks and Egyptians. Greeks had very close trading partnerships with the Egyptians. Also, a lot of Greeks had taken service as mercenaries in Egypt or had gone there as traveling professionals, as entertainers, as physicians, as people with special skills that they could sell to the people who had money to pay for it, which was the Egyptians, because the Egyptians had all the money in the world. Greeks also had close relationships with the Scythians, a very different group of people, semi-nomadic people living on the steppes of what is today Ukraine, what we hope remains Ukraine. People who lived a very different lifestyle than the Greeks, who were mobile, who traveled around the steppes, and who the Greeks thought of as very different from themselves. And Herodotus was very interested in both of these groups of people, the Egyptians and the Scythians, not just because they were connected with the Greeks, but also because they had their own distinct histories with the Persians. And Herodotus thought that those histories helped explain the history of the Greeks as well. Herodotus had a great admiration for the Egyptians. There were a lot of things about Egypt he found fascinating and admirable. To him, Egypt was a place of incredible antiquity and wisdom and knowledge. Egypt was unfathomably old for the Greeks. Herodotus went to see the pyramids of Giza. To him, they were as old as the Colosseum in Rome is to us. He believed that the Egyptians were the oldest people in the world, that he were the first people to have knowledge of the gods and who shared that knowledge with the rest of the world. He tells an anecdote which gives an idea of how ancient, how wise he thought the Egyptians were. He told the story of another Greek, someone about a generation older than him, by the name of Hecataeus, who went to Egypt, much as Herodotus did, who talked with the priests there, gathered information from them in much the same way that Herodotus was doing. And according to the story that Herodotus tells, Hecataeus, this Greek, showed up in Egypt. He was talking with the Egyptian priests, and he very proudly went through his genealogy for them. And my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, he went back 16 generations all the way to Zeus. Now, he was very proud of this. He could count back 16 generations, and there's a god there. And the Egyptian priests patted him on the back and took him into a temple and showed him a line of statues. And every one of these statues is the statue of a priest. And each priest was the son of the priest who came before him. So here are the Egyptian generations. And they stretched on and on. There were more than 200 statues, some of them so old they were falling to pieces. And that was how old Egypt was. You can almost imagine the Egyptian priests looking at Hecataeus saying, "Oh, you're adorable. 16 generations, you think that's old?" That was how Greeks like Herodotus thought about the Egyptians, incalculably, unfathomably old. And with that age came wisdom and knowledge. And yet, at the same time, that great antiquity, that great knowledge, was no use against the Persians. Egypt was conquered. The Egyptians barely even put up a fight, at least as far as Herodotus tells it. Something about that great weight of antiquity and knowledge weighed the Egyptians down. It made them weak, made them soft. The Scythians were entirely different. Where the Egyptians were the oldest people in the world, Herodotus says the Scythians are the youngest people in the world. The Egyptians share their knowledge with everyone. The Scythians don't want to know anything from anybody. If a Scythian learns another culture's ways, they kill him, according to Herodotus. And there are a lot of things about the Scythians that Herodotus finds kind of Now, they have some weird practices. Some of the ways they worship the gods are a little off-putting. The kind of things they eat, he doesn't even want to talk about. But at the same time, the Scythians, like the Greeks, are one of the few people in the world who beat the Persians. Something about their lack of knowledge, lack of sophistication, gives them strength and vigor, the ability to stand up against the Persians and do it with style. So a story that Herodotus tells us about the Scythians is that the Persians, under their king Darius, invaded Scythia. And the Scythians did what steppe peoples always do. They fell back. They refused to fight. They just fell back across the steppes, drew the Persians in, drew them further away from their supply lines. And the Persians were getting very, very frustrated with this. And they sent messengers to the Scythians telling them, if you think you can beat us, then stand and fight. If you know you can't beat us, then just surrender. And they got a message back from the Scythians, which was 4 objects: a mouse, a frog, a bird, and some arrows. And King Darius took these objects and he looked at them. He was trying to make sense of them. And he puzzled them out. All right, the mouse lives in the earth, so they're giving us the earth. Frogs live in the water, so they're giving us water. And this is how you surrender to the Persians. You send them earth and water. That is the symbol of surrender. Okay, they're surrendering to us. Good. The bird. What do we do with the bird? Well, and here you can tell Darius is reaching a bit. Birds are fast. Horses are fast. So they're giving us their horses. The arrows are pretty straightforward. They're giving us their weapons. All right, they're surrendering and they're turning over their arms to us. This is what King Darius thinks it means. One of his advisors looks over him and says, no. Here's what the message means. You Persians had better turn yourselves into mice and burrow in the ground, or turn into frogs and jump in the water, or turn into birds and fly away. And if you don't, we're going to come hunt you down with our arrows. This is essentially saying to the king of the biggest, richest, most powerful nation in the world, go bleep yourself in the bleep with a bleep. That's how the Scythians dealt with the Persians. And whatever else Herodotus may think about them, however repulsive he may find them in other ways, he admires that. That kind of spirit is what it takes to resist an invader. The Scythians had it, the Egyptians didn't. And Herodotus takes all of these ideas and puts them together, and we can see the scheme that he's working with. There's a kind of geographic logic here. The Egyptians in the far south, the Scythians in the far north, are opposites of each other. Egyptians are old, Scythians are young. Egyptians are sedentary, Scythians are mobile, and so on. The Greeks are in the middle, golden mean. So they get the best of both. They have something of the wisdom of the Egyptians. They're able to learn from a larger world. But they also have something of the spirit of the Scythians. They're willing to stand up and fight when they're threatened. Herodotus and other writers of his generation, other Greek writers, expanded on these ideas. They built up a kind of model of the world that makes sense in a geographic way. Where you are in the world, north, south, east, west, kind of explains who you are as a people. Now, this idea, this concept, got passed down to the Romans, who took it on as they took on a lot of other Greek ideas and Greek culture, but also transformed it, because they had different needs. They took these Greek ideas and they changed them because they had a different way of interacting with the world. Because Greeks' contact with the larger world is primarily as merchants, as mercenaries, as traveling professionals. They were interested in how other people were different because they had to know, what have you got that we could buy from you? What do you need that we could sell you? What kind of services do you need that we could provide? That was their way of interacting with the world. Romans interacted with the world differently. Romans were conquerors. Romans built an empire. And one of Rome's strengths as an empire was that the people that they conquered, they did not eliminate, they did not subjugate, they incorporated. They made them part of their own culture. You could become a Roman. If your ancestors were Gauls or Egyptians or Africans or Iberians, it didn't matter. You could learn to speak Latin, you could put on a toga, you could drink good wine and eat good olive oil, and you could be just as Roman as someone from Italy. And in this way, the Romans were able to draw into their empire the best and the brightest from all of the peoples that they had conquered. And that gave their empire resilience and strength. And so the Romans had a different way of thinking about people who were different, which is, you didn't have to be different. You could change. You might be a barbarian today. That doesn't mean you always would be a barbarian. You could begin as a barbarian, you could become something else. You could become a Roman. And this idea of change over time is one that we see particularly strongly in one of the Roman writers who gives us our most detailed view of how the Romans thought about other people in their world, and that is the historian Tacitus. Tacitus wrote about peoples of Rome's northern and western frontiers. He wrote an ethnographic treatise called the Germania, which is all about the people whom the Romans called Germans, who were found along the northern frontier. He also wrote the Agricola, which was a biography of his father-in-law, who was the governor of Britain. And as part of that, he gives us a fair amount of detail about the people of Britain, the people that he encountered there, both among people who were already part of the Roman province and people who were beyond, who were outside the frontiers that Agricola had to go and face on the battlefield. And Tacitus has certain ideas about who these people were, those people of the northern frontier. And overall, they're pretty disgusting. They live in filth, they have no sense of civilization, they have no organization, they can't hold themselves together, they're completely unreliable. On the other hand, they do have some good qualities. And one of the most important of those is they have a certain native virtue. They are uncorrupted by the luxuries of civilization. There's a few telling lines in Tacitus' writing. He says of the Germans, "No one among them finds vice amusing, or speaks of love affairs and seductions as being fashionable." This is an idea he comes back to over and over again, this idea that these repulsive northern barbarians, disgusting as they are, have something that the Romans lack, and that is the ability to perceive truth. So when he writes about his father-in-law Agricola fighting in Britain, fighting on the frontier against the peoples of what's today Scotland, who the Romans called Caledonians, he gives us the speech that was given by Calgacus, the leader of the Caledonians. Now, of course, Tacitus had no idea what was said among an opposing army. He used the sophisticated historical technique known as making crap up. But the stuff that he made up is telling, because he comes back to this idea. Those barbarians are the ones who can see us for who we are. The final line, the exclamation point at the end of that speech about the Romans, this is one of the Latin phrases you need to know in your life. Ubi solitudinem faciunt pacem appellant. Where they have made a wasteland, they call it peace. It's the barbarians who can see the truth. The Romans can't. And when he talks about the Britons who lived within the province, who lived under Roman rule, he says, they're becoming Romans. They're learning to wear the toga. They're learning to go to the bathhouse. They're learning about fine dining. They're starting to behave like us. And they call this civilization, when really this is part of their enslavement. As they become Roman, they lose the ability to perceive truth. So just like with Herodotus, we can lay out a geographic scheme. With Tacitus, we can map this over time. Tacitus' concept of how civilization works is it's a progression over time. Every society starts in a state of savagery, completely devoid of civilization, and yet possessing a basic native virtue. And over time, they get more sophisticated, wiser, until they reach a peak of civilization. But it doesn't stop there. From there, it's all downhill. corruption sets in, and they slide down into decadence. As far as Tacitus is concerned, every culture is somewhere along this continuum. And from his point of view, he thought the Germans were just barely starting out. They are almost complete savages, but they're on their way up. Rome has hit its peak, and it has started to come down. And the day is going to come when the Germans are up there and the Romans are down there. And Tacitus was very, very worried about that day. Now, the reality of the Roman Empire is that things were changing. All around the Roman frontiers, cultures were changing, societies were adapting, because they had to. Small individual societies could not stand up against the Romans. To be able to deal with the Romans on anything like an equal footing, they had to find ways to organize themselves into larger, more coherent, more stable alliances. And in the 2nd century, Rome went through a period of crises, a series of civil wars, multiple emperors rising to power and very quickly falling again, on top of economic crises, on top of an outbreak of endemic disease, which left Rome for a period of 50 years very weakened and unable to deal with the frontier in any effective way. And this took the pressure off of the frontier, and it made some breathing room for a lot of new groups to form on the frontier. So from the late 3rd century on, we have lots of new names on the frontier. We show up people like Saxons, Franks, Goths, Alemanni. Now those are in the north. We find the similar things elsewhere. In Africa, we have Garamantes, Laguatan, Nobades, Blemues. In the Arabian Peninsula, we have the formation of new tribal groups, such as the Lahmids, the Ghassanids. Everywhere on the Roman frontier, these smaller groups of people were organizing themselves into larger, more cohesive alliances. Also in the 3rd century, the old Parthian Empire was overthrown and a new Sasanian dynasty came to power, which was much more centralized, more well-organized, and better able to face the Romans on their frontier on an equal footing. And so the last couple of centuries of Roman history are this experience of having a big, dangerous rival in the east, and all along the frontier, these new alliances, same groups of people, but now working together, and putting up resistance on a scale the Romans had not faced before. So the last few centuries of Roman writers really reflect this experience. And some of them reflected with a degree of panic. The idea that all of a sudden there is a great danger in the east, and even though these alliances were forming everywhere on the Roman frontier, it is the north that the Roman writers were really concerned with, because the north was where the most immediate threat to the Italian peninsula, later to Constantinople, to the heartlands of the Roman Empire were. This is the legacy that comes down from late Roman literature, the idea that there are these dangerous people in the north and these dangerous people in the east. And the Roman writers wrote about them using these old established barbarian tropes, the idea of there are some peoples who are poor, unsophisticated, violent, and there's other peoples who are big, rich, sophisticated, well-organized. Out of that, late Roman literature creates these two archetypes, the northern barbarian and the eastern barbarian. These two archetypes that have their roots as far back as Herodotus, but really are crystallized in the late Roman period. These come down as part of the legacy of Western literature and art. And they continue to shape the ways in which we picture and describe the people we think of as barbarians. On the one hand, we have the northern barbarian. Poor, unsophisticated, ignorant, violent, but possessed of a native virtue, a sense of honor, uncorrupted by civilization. And on the other hand, we have the Eastern barbarian, saturated with luxury, overindulgent, corrupted, but at the same time, the heir to a great legacy of antiquity and wisdom and knowledge. These archetypes, the northern barbarian, the eastern barbarian, have taken root and have been very influential in how people in the Western world think about and write about the people that we see as not one of us. And they were particularly productive during the period of European imperialism and colonialism in the rest of the world. These are basically the two ways in which Europeans have written about non-European people. Some people, like Native Americans, Africans, Polynesians, Aboriginal Australians, get written about with the northern archetype. Poor, uncivilized, ignorant, yet also there's something noble about them, a kind of virtue. Whereas other peoples, in places like China, India, the Middle East, Mesoamerica, they get treated with the Eastern barbarian archetype. Rich, sophisticated, possessed of great wisdom, but also corrupt, decadent, lacking self-control, luxurious. And these ideas have continued down. They have become part of our common vocabulary. So it's not just our own world that we describe like this. These two models, these two archetypes, the northern barbarian and the eastern barbarian, are part of how we write about imaginary worlds. So imagine, if you will, someone is writing a work of fantasy centered on a place that sort of resembles Western Europe. Well, would you think that they would add in, say, some wild, dangerous northern barbarians who threaten them from the north, and some luxurious, overindulgent, sophisticated kingdoms in the east? Who would do that? Well, somebody would. Or suppose you're writing a work of science fiction, and you want to have two opposing powers. Well, could one of them be this decadent, overindulgent empire that's past its prime, and another one be this rising people who are unsophisticated, who lack sophistication, lack advancement, but also have a basic sense of honor? Could you imagine doing that? Or that? Now, there are good and bad qualities to both the northern and eastern barbarians. You could split them out. You can have good northern barbarians and bad northern barbarians. Good eastern barbarians, bad eastern barbarians. So we can have the honorable warriors of the north. We can also have the unsophisticated brutes. We can have the wise Easterners who are heirs to great wisdom, and we can also have the Easterners who are devious and treacherous. All of this is part of our legacy. It ultimately draws back to a very ancient history of thinking about and dealing with a larger world. And when we're aware of where these ideas come from, we can see them everywhere. So I'm going to leave things at that. Happy to take questions, but thank you very much for being here, and I hope you found it interesting. And if you are interested in this topic further, here's the shameless plug. Here's my book. It's available both in physical copy and as an ebook. And if you are interested, that's something you can look. So, yes, question here.
Thank you. How much do you know of the Eastern views on barbarians, which is something I've encountered a few times? For example, in Japanese, there used to be the word namban, meaning Western barbarians, which was like used during the contact between like Europeans and Japanese and that time. I find that particularly interesting myself.
It is, certainly in my period, it's a historical rarity that you get the other side of the perspective. You get the comments from the other peoples about someone else. Of course, everyone has these ideas that we are the people who have it figured out, everyone else has got something wrong with them, otherwise they'd be more like us. So I don't know very much about those Eastern sources. I can't comment in very much detail, but in many cases, we can see some of these same archetypes coming up again, these ideas of people who are not like us because they are not as wise as we are, or because they are wiser than we are. People who are younger than we are or who are older than we are. There's ways of organizing and explaining relationships in the world. I'm sorry I can't add much more to that, but thank you for asking that. Any other questions, or not a question, more of a comment?
What inspired you to research this topic? You're telling the younger years.
So that was what interested me in this topic. Was that? Yeah. Hey, well, really my inspiration comes from two places. One was I had an amazing professor when I was an undergraduate, who was an art historian, but who worked on many of these same topics, who looked at how other cultures were portrayed in art. And that inspired me. And I also had an experience as a student of coming from a very, very small place, coming from a very small rural town, and going to New York freaking city, which is about as far as you can get from a very small rural town, and feeling extremely out of place. And feeling like I was a barbarian. And that got me interested in thinking about, well, surely people in the ancient world had these same experiences. The experience of being outside of your own culture, encountering a place that was very different, that did not make you feel like you belonged, and having to think about what did that mean and what does that tell me about who I am. And it's really the combination of those two experiences that have brought me to this topic. Thank you. So we have a question back here. All right, go ahead. I think so. I think I see where you're going. Yeah, the barbarian as we know it in something like Dungeons and Dragons or other games like that very much draws on the tradition of the northern barbarian, particularly the good side of the northern barbarian. This idea of a character who is untouched by civilization, who's still possessed of this basic native virtue, who because they are untouched, uncorrupted, can see solutions to problems that other people don't see. And the solution to the problem is usually hit it very hard with an axe. solution to every problem is go and start a fight. But small societies have to live that way because they do not have institutions that can enforce peace on people who do not want to be peaceful. And some of these peoples that Tacitus and Herodotus were writing about were living at that kind of small scale, where violence was part of their everyday life. We don't know what they fantasized about. Did they fantasize about a world where they didn't have to go hit someone with an axe every time they had a problem? But we living in the world where that's not an option, we get to fantasize about that as a way of solving our problems. I really don't feel like I'm answering your question, but I hope at least it was interesting to listen to. And we have a question back here. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. All right. Spartans are complicated. I mean this in every possible way. Much of the popular image of Spartans is an illusion. It is a mirage. But it is an illusion that the Spartans themselves created and cultivated and encouraged, because it was to their advantage to be thought of as these insane people who will stand and fight no matter what. Because if everyone thinks you're these insane people who will stand and fight no matter what, most of the time you don't actually have to fight. They will give up as soon as you show up. That is what usually happened to the Spartans. The Spartans probably did less fighting than any other Greeks because they were able to maintain this reputation, this illusion, drawing on many of these same ideas, exactly as you say. Right? They played to many of these same tropes themselves. But I think we are running out of time here. So I'm happy to continue conversations outside the room, but we need to vacate now so the next group can get in. Thank you once again. It's been a treat to talk to you.